It has been brought to my attention that you don't know who John Milton was. Allow me to illuminate you. John Milton was born in London, England on December 9th, 1608, and presumably died in 1674. He is most famous for writing the last super poem, commonly known as an epic, Paradise Lost. John Milton was a poet, a pamphleteer, and historian. He wrote poetry from a very young age. He spent 20 years at the forefront of radical republican politics. Then, when his cause failed, he finally created his masterwork, Paradise Lost. John Milton spoke many languages, so he read everything in its original language. His family was bourgeois. They were cultured and very Protestant. John Milton's father made sure he received a proper education, and Milton would always be deeply grateful to his father for his education in languages. Just so that you get an idea, John Milton spoke Latin, of course, Greek, Hebrew, and its dialects, Italian, French, Spanish, and Dutch. Not bad, if I may say so myself. As a young man, John Milton fancied himself as the next big thing in English literature. He announced of his intentions to glorify England and the English language in poetry. John Milton was arrogant. He portrayed himself as a prophetic bard, and he took his first steps that would turn him into England's most important poet, second only to the all-time favorite, William Shakespeare. He wrote a bunch of poems in which he practiced and displayed his mastery over the poetic form. Before John Milton, no English poet carried themselves so outwardly and self-consciously as an author. His determination, sprinkled with just the right amount of arrogance, as well as the privilege, and I mean it, of not having to work for a living, allowed him to pursue a poetic career. Some would hesitate to call John Milton arrogant, but he was. There's no way around it. His personal history is deeply tied with the history of England in his lifetime. John Milton was an active participant in matters of church and state, so much that whenever he signed, he would write, John Milton, Englishman. I mean, he was literally presenting himself as England's writer, as the prophetic bard. There is no doubt in my mind that he considered himself an author, and that meant that Milton saw himself as, and I quote, the spokesman for the nation as a whole, even when he found himself in a minority of one. After university, John Milton embarked on what can only be described as his very own PhD in world literature, with the financial support of his father, of course. During 6 years, Milton dedicated himself to read and to travel. He studied everything from ancient and modern theology, philosophy, history, science, politics, and literature. And then, if that doesn't rhyme with privilege, he followed it up with a 15-month grand tour of France, Italy, and Switzerland. While touring Europe, John Milton wrote a poem about procrastination. He wrote the pastoral elegy Lycidas, lamenting the death of Edward King, not an actual king, just a fellow student. The poem memorializes his friend and also serves as an occasion for him to meditate on his own poetic aspirations and endeavors, his anxieties regarding the role of poetry, and for not having yet completed his grand poetic project. Again, he wrote a poem about procrastination. In other words, John Milton wonders whether or not he is wasting his life, a feeling not uncommon among the youth of the 21st century. So, at the age of 30, John Milton was not sure if he would be able to fulfill his promise of writing the next epic poem. The death of Edward King, not an actual king, prompted Milton to reevaluate his life's work and reminded him that he was very mortal, and also that time is always running out. A lot of Milton's treatises were inspired by his personal concerns, and as any writer out there, his own life bleeds onto his works. He wrote and distributed pamphlets on topics that were deeply important to him. John Milton denounced the church-government relations. He wrote tracts on divorce, education, regicide, republicanism, and most importantly, he wrote the famous defense of freedom of the press, Areopagitica. These tracts that Milton wrote were of course not popular, and they were denounced by Parliament. I mean, what did you expect? Freedom of the press? John Milton's writings could not be licensed, meaning that he could not obtain a license to get them published. John Milton was a radical. He was a rebel that opposed Parliament's ordinance for the regulating of printing, or as the cool kids say, the licensing order. Areopagitica is addressed to the Calvinist parliaments of the time who believed in God's sovereignty sovereignty and the authority of the Bible. So, for John Milton, a free press was vital to the creation of a reformed English culture. John Milton continued publishing political pamphlets. That was an alliteration if you didn't notice. And after the execution of King Charles, he was appointed as Latin Secretary to the Commonwealth government, which basically meant that his job was to write letters in Latin to other countries. Sadly, Milton experienced his share of tragedies. His first wife died in childbirth, his son died as well, and on 1652 he became totally blind, according to him, because as a little boy he used to read until midnight. So yeah, there's that. Oh, also his second wife died and he wrote a poem about it. It's the one poem university teachers hand over to their teaching assistants because it's just that boring. And then that guy Cromwell died in 1658, which led to the chaos and the eventual restoration of the monarchy. Fun times. So as any member of an overthrown government would do in that situation, dear Milton went into hiding, because he may or may not have published multiple pamphlets celebrating and sanctioning the king's execution. Again, he was a very politically active individual. He even published a second edition of his Ready and Easy Way to Establish a Free Commonwealth, just 2 weeks before the monarchy was restored in 1660. While he was technically a public enemy and a fugitive, John Milton managed to stay hidden for a couple of months, but ultimately he was arrested. However, a friend of his, Andrew Marvell, another poet, somehow managed to get him pardoned and released from jail. After a life of turmoil and political activism, John Milton found himself totally blind, disappointed because the good old cause of the revolution didn't go his way, and he was now 50 years old. Also, he was plagued by attacks of gout every now and then, but at least he had his third wife, who actually survived him. So there he was, defeated, disappointed, and blinded. But against all odds, and with the help of his daughters and friends who helped him transcribe his dictations, he completed his epic poem and fulfilled his promise he had made to himself and to the world a long time ago. Paradise Lost by John Milton changed poetry as we know it, and that is where our story begins. Remember to subscribe, hit the notifications bell so you don't miss out, and leave a comment with your favorite passage of Paradise Lost. Remember that if you want to support the channel, you can visit chrysalis.ca and buy one of our short stories. I recommend Worlds of Omniscience if you are into Milton. So yeah, au revoir.